The old pickup coughed and sputtered as it rolled to a stop at the end of a long gravel driveway. Dust swirled in the golden light of late afternoon, the thick line of pines pressing in from all sides, their shadows stretched long across the clearing. Noah Harper sat behind the wheel for a moment, hands gripping the cracked steering wheel, watching the thin plume of smoke rise from under the hood. He exhaled slowly and pushed the door open, stepping down into the crunch of gravel beneath his worn boots. He wiped his calloused hands on the thighs of his faded jeans, his flannel shirt hanging loose over his frame. Not by choice, but from weeks of skipped meals. Being a single dad wasn't just about the broken sleep or the gnawing anxiety. It was about making impossible decisions. Whether to fix the leaking roof back home or buy new shoes for his 9-year-old daughter, Grace. Whether to take on another job and miss another school play, or stay home and risk the rent being late. His eyes rose to the cabin ahead. It sat in the clearing like an old photograph left too long in the sun, faded, cracked, barely holding together. He took in the sagging porch, the glass missing from one of the windows, the shutters hanging askew. The listing in the classifieds had been sparse, seeking help to restore family cabin. Pay negotiable, but it was the next line that had snagged him. Help wanted immediately. That was all Noah needed to hear. The sound of soft footsteps on gravel made him turn. A woman approached, maybe late 30s, her brown hair pulled back in a loose braid. She wore jeans and an old sweatshirt with the sleeves shoved up to her elbows, and her hands, he noticed, were stained with something like paint or varnish. Her smile was polite but tired, like she hadn't quite slept through the night in years. "You must be Noah," she said, her voice gentle but sure. "Yeah," he replied, offering his hand. She shook it firmly. There was a faint tremble in her grip that told him more than he needed to know. Someone running, maybe from the past, or maybe from herself, but too proud to admit it. "I'm Mara," she introduced herself. "Sorry about the mess." Her eyes flicked toward the dilapidated house. I wanted to feel like home again." Noah gave a small nod. "I'll do my best." And so, the work began. The first few days passed in a steady rhythm. The autumn air was crisp, the trees a riot of orange and red, their leaves blanketing the forest floor like a quilt. Noah stripped away the rotten planks on the porch, replacing them with new boards he cut himself. He hammered supports into the frame of the cabin, reinforced the beams beneath the roof. Every nail driven, every piece of wood sanded smooth was a small act of reclaiming. Each night, he returned to his small apartment on the edge of town, where Grace waited with questions that made his chest ache. "Can we live in a cabin one day, Dad?" she'd ask, wide-eyed, hope shining in her voice. He would smile and kiss her forehead. "Maybe one day, kiddo." And in the silence of his own thoughts, he'd admit to himself that he didn't know how much longer one day could wait. Mara wasn't like most of his clients. She didn't hover, didn't micromanage. Sometimes she brought him coffee and sat on the sagging porch as he worked, watching the leaves fall with a faraway look in her eyes. Sometimes she asked about Grace, about Noah's life before his wife left. But not out of pity. There was a quiet curiosity there, a way of listening that made him feel less like someone being examined and more like someone being understood. One evening, as he packed up his tools, Mara's voice broke the silence. "You're good at this," she said quietly. "Building something out of nothing." Noah chuckled. "Yeah, well, I've been doing that most of my life." Mara smiled faintly, but there was a heaviness in her gaze. "Me too." He didn't press. They were both learning how to stand still without falling apart. The turning point came on a stormy afternoon, weeks into the job. The sky darkened unexpectedly as Noah balanced on the roof, replacing the last of the shingles. A sudden gust of wind hit him hard, and he lost his footing. He landed hard on his side, pain shooting through his ankle as he twisted it awkwardly on the way down. By the time he opened his eyes, Mara was already there. Her hands, steady now, guided him up with surprising strength. She helped him inside, fetched ice from the ancient freezer, and wrapped his ankle herself. She didn't call a staff member or an assistant. There were none. Just her, fumbling through her phone for a doctor's number with shaky fingers. The next day, Mara insisted on driving him home. Noah said no at first, but she wasn't the type to be argued with. When they reached his rundown apartment complex, he saw it through new eyes, peeling paint, broken steps, and all. Grace peeked out from behind the door when they arrived. Her eyes widened at the sight of Mara, who knelt and smiled gently. "You must be Grace," she said. Grace giggled and whispered, "She looks like a princess." Mara's eyes softened, but she didn't correct her. The cabin came alive as the weeks passed. A new roof, solid walls, a porch swing that Noah built from scratch hung from thick chains. But something else was being built too, a bond between Noah and Mara, quiet and unspoken. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. Just two people who knew the weight of broken things, learning what it meant to mend them. And then came the last day. Noah packed up his tools, loading them into the back of his truck. Mara stood nearby, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. "This place looks like home again," she said. "You did most of the work," Noah replied. She shook her head. "You gave it a future." She handed him an envelope then, and he opened it without thinking. But what he found inside made his hands tremble. A check for $50,000. "Mara, this has to be a mistake," he stammered. She shook her head, her eyes glistening. "No, Noah, it's not." He tried to push it back into her hands. "I can't take this." Mara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You don't know me, Noah. I inherited more money than I ever wanted. It's why I came here, to get away from all the noise. But you," she faltered, then continued. "You reminded me of something I thought I'd forgotten. What it means to build something with your hands. To keep going when it feels like everything is caving in." Noah's throat tightened. He blinked hard, willing himself not to cry. "I didn't do this for a handout." "It's not a handout," Mara said softly. "It's a thank you for fixing more than just a cabin." Weeks later, the cabin stood proud and strong in its clearing. Noah used part of the money to move Grace into a small but solid home on the edge of a neighborhood where the grass was green and the windows all had glass. One evening, as he grilled burgers on a secondhand barbecue, a familiar car pulled up. Mara stepped out, holding a small potted plant in her hands. "Housewarming gift," she said, grinning. Grace clapped her hands. "It's like a fairy tale." "Noah mit Marashgesh." "Yeah," he whispered. "I guess it is. Because sometimes the richest gifts don't come from money. They come from kindness. From the people who remind us that even the most broken things can be rebuilt. And sometimes we find a home where we least expect it.